I had decided to spend the late morning in my garden, a little slice of sanctuary I had nurtured for years. The roses were in bloom, their petals catching the sun in shades of deep crimson and soft peach. I was kneeling by the lavender bushes, hands dirt-stained and heart surprisingly light, when I heard footsteps on the path behind the fence. I didn't turn immediately, partly out of habit, partly because I wanted the day to remain quiet. But then a familiar voice cut through the hum of bees and the faint rustle of leaves. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I glanced up to see Thomas, my neighbor, standing near the gate. He was in his mid-60s, gray starting to show at the temples, and always had that quiet, easy smile that made people feel like they were being seen. My first instinct was to nod politely, to keep my attention on the garden, but something in the softness of his tone made me pause. "Yes, it is," I said, brushing soil from my hands. "Perfect for flowers to bloom." He leaned casually against the gate, glancing at the roses I had been tending. "You've really done something special here," he said, his eyes scanning each bloom as though he could see the work, the patience, and the small triumphs hidden in each petal. I felt a warmth that wasn't entirely about the sun, and I realized I was smiling without thinking. We started talking about the usual things: weather, gardening tips, the little changes in the neighborhood. But then, unexpectedly, the conversation took a more personal turn. He mentioned something about feeling stuck in routines, about missing the quiet, simple moments that actually made life feel rich. I found myself nodding, surprised at how freely I was opening up, sharing thoughts I hadn't voiced in years. There was no judgment in his listening, only a presence that felt rare and soothing. And then he said it. Just a simple sentence, almost casual, but it hit me harder than I expected. "I envy your ability to just be here, fully, with the world paused around you." I froze for a heartbeat, unsure how to respond. No one had ever said anything like that to me before, not in a way that felt truly seen. Something shifted in that moment, a subtle recognition, a spark of connection that wasn't about romance or flirtation or anything superficial. It was about acknowledging the quiet beauty in another person's life and realizing that it resonated deeply within your own. We continued talking, but the air had changed. There was an intimacy to our conversation now, a gentle tension that was neither uncomfortable nor forced. I found myself laughing softly at stories he shared, and he seemed genuinely interested in the minutiae of my daily life, my favorite blooms, the way the light hit the garden in the late afternoon, the small rituals that made me feel alive. By the time he finally excused himself, promising to check in on my tomatoes next week, I felt lighter than I had in months. There was a quiet thrill in having met someone who could see the world the way I did, and it lingered like the scent of lavender, subtle but unmistakable. I stayed in the garden for a while longer, letting the sunlight wash over me, reflecting on the unexpected conversation that had shifted something inside me. That day, I realized that connection can appear in the simplest of forms, and that sometimes a single sentence can stay with you, echoing in the heart long after it's been spoken. After that afternoon, I found myself thinking about Thomas more often than I expected. It wasn't an infatuation or anything fleeting. It was more like discovering a familiar note in a song I hadn't heard in years. Every time I walked through the garden, tending to the roses or trimming the hedges, I would catch myself imagining him leaning against the gate, saying something that made the world feel lighter. A few days later, I was in the garden again, this time watering the small vegetable patch near the back fence. The sun was softer, falling in golden stripes across the lawn. I hadn't expected anyone, but of course there he was. Thomas appeared just beyond the fence, holding a basket of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. He gave me a small, shy wave, and my heart did that strange little jump that it sometimes did when something unexpected felt right. "I thought you might like these," he said, offering the basket. The smell of warm bread mixed with the scent of my roses, and for a moment, the ordinary afternoon seemed magical. "Thank you," I replied, taking a loaf and brushing crumbs from my fingers. "That's very thoughtful of you." We fell into conversation as naturally as one breath follows another. We spoke about small things at first: the weather, the birds that had returned to the neighborhood, the new coffee shop a few blocks away. But gradually, the topics became more personal. He talked about his late wife, how we still missed the quiet companionship they had shared, and I spoke about my children, my own sense of solitude, and the little joys I'd carved out in my life. There was no awkwardness, no need to fill silence with meaningless chatter. Every pause felt like part of the rhythm between us, a gentle acknowledgement that we were both listening, truly listening. Then, unexpectedly, he asked me a question that made me pause. "Do you ever feel like people just don't see you? The real you, I mean?" I hesitated. That question was so simple, yet so loaded, as if it had been waiting for someone to finally ask it. "Yes," I said slowly, "more than I'd like to admit. Sometimes it feels like everyone sees the surface, but not the depth." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "I feel the same way. And yet, sometimes when you meet someone who notices even the small things, it's enough to change your day, or maybe even more." It was that subtle honesty that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. I realized then that our connection wasn't about romance or temptation. It was about being seen, being acknowledged for the parts of ourselves we usually hide. There was a quiet intensity in that realization, an emotional intimacy that neither of us had sought but both had found. We stayed in the garden until the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and amber. By the time he left, the world felt different. Somehow lighter. Somehow more real. I closed the gate behind him and leaned against it, breathing in the mixed scents of bread, lavender, and fading sunlight. I felt a strange sense of gratitude, grateful for this unanticipated connection, for the way it had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. That night, I lay awake, replaying our conversation in my mind. I thought about how rare it was to meet someone who could share your silence as easily as your words. And I realized that maybe sometimes life's most profound experiences aren't loud or dramatic. They are quiet, fleeting, and completely unexpected. The days that followed carried a strange sweetness. I found myself waiting for small moments when our paths might cross, even if only briefly. Gardening had become a kind of meditation, not just for the plants, but for my thoughts, my heart, and the quiet anticipation of seeing Thomas again. Every time I stepped outside, the air seemed to hum with possibility, subtle but undeniable. One afternoon, as the sun leaned low and the shadows stretched across the lawn, I heard him calling from the fence. "Do you have a moment?" I wiped my hands on my apron, my pulse quickening without reason. He leaned over the gate, holding a folded newspaper. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said. Inside were articles about local gardening tips, community events, even a few photographs of flowers I recognized. It was simple, thoughtful, and intimate in a way that words sometimes couldn't capture. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, touched by the care in his gesture. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said softly. "You know, sometimes it feels like these small things are the only way we can really show someone we notice them." I smiled, feeling a warmth spreading through me. That afternoon, we lingered near the gate, sharing stories about our lives, childhood memories, and the quiet routines that had shaped us. There was no rush, no pressure, just a steady, comforting presence that made the world outside the garden fade into a gentle blur. At some point, the conversation turned to regrets, those moments we never speak of, the chances we never take. I admitted, almost shyly, that I had always envied people who could find joy in fleeting connections without fear of judgment. Thomas nodded, understanding more than words could say. "You know," he said, "sometimes it's the unexpected conversations that teach us the most about ourselves." about what we truly need. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I realized that he was right. Until now, I had been living cautiously, hiding parts of myself behind routines and polite smiles. Yet, in his presence, I felt freer, more authentic. I wasn't seeking anything from him. No promises, no commitments, only a shared acknowledgement of the life we were both navigating. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in amber and violet, Thomas hesitated for a moment. "May I ask something personal?" I nodded. "Would you ever spend a little more time with me? Just talking, walking, sharing these quiet moments." My heart thudded, but it wasn't fear. It was recognition, a deep understanding that what he was offering was respect, companionship, and emotional connection, the kind that nourishes the soul. "I would like that," I said, and in that simple exchange, something shifted. The fence between our gardens, which had once been a physical boundary, now felt less like a barrier and more like a meeting point, where two people could meet honestly without pretense. After he left that evening, I stood in the garden, letting the cool air brush against my skin, thinking about the delicate tension that had grown between us. It wasn't about desire or fleeting attraction. It was about being fully seen and fully heard. And in that realization, I found a quiet joy, a new sense of possibility, and a hope that connection, even when unexpected, could change the course of a life. Days turned into weeks, and our quiet connection grew, not in grand gestures, but in the subtle, meaningful ways that only two people who truly see each other can share. Thomas and I began spending longer stretches of time together in the garden, talking, laughing, and sometimes sitting in comfortable silence while the world carried on beyond the fence. It wasn't about escaping life. It was about discovering its richness in the small, overlooked moments. One golden afternoon, I found myself telling him about my childhood garden, a place I had loved but had long since forgotten. As I spoke, he listened with that same patient attentiveness that had first drawn me in. When I finished, he said softly, "You've carried so much beauty inside you all along, and I'm just grateful to witness it." His words struck me with an unexpected clarity. I realized that our connection wasn't about dependence or longing. It was about recognition. Two souls acknowledging each other's presence, each finding in the other a mirror to parts of themselves they had almost forgotten existed. We began tending a small new project together, a corner of my garden that had been neglected for years. With our hands in the soil, planting and pruning side by side, we laughed at our clumsy attempts to move heavy pots and shared stories about our lives that were both funny and tender. It was in those shared moments, quiet and deliberate, that I understood the depth of the bond we had formed. One late afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows and the roses glowed with the warmth of the fading light, Thomas paused and looked at me with an intensity that was gentle, respectful, and entirely sincere. "I never expected to find this," he said. "This. Connection, understanding. It feels rare, almost impossible." I smiled, feeling the same truth reflected in my own heart. "Neither did I admitted, but I'm glad we did." We stood there, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers, the soft hum of bees, and the quiet rhythm of lives intersecting. I realized that moments like this, unexpected, tender, and deeply human, are the ones that leave the most lasting mark. They teach us to be seen, to see, and to embrace life's subtler joys with open hearts. When he finally left, promising to return the next day with more seedlings, I lingered in the garden, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Not for what had happened or what might happen, but for the simple fact that connection had found its way into my life when I least expected it. As I walked inside that evening, the garden still glowing in the soft twilight, I reflected on the journey of those past weeks. I had discovered that emotional intimacy doesn't always come with fireworks or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it comes quietly, persistently, in the shared silence, in the attentiveness of another human being, and in the gentle acknowledgement of one another's presence. I closed my eyes, breathing in the lingering fragrance of roses, and smiled. Life had a way of surprising us, of offering moments that were deeper, richer, and far more meaningful than we could have imagined. And in that garden, in the warmth of an unexpected friendship that had become something extraordinary, I had found a new sense of peace, joy, and understanding.